A message begins as words on paper. An operator reads each letter and converts it into a sequence: short pulse, long pulse, silence. The pattern moves through wire as electrical current, traveling distances no voice could reach. At the far end, another operator listens. The pulses arrive as sound. The sound becomes letters. The letters reform into the original message. Between the two operators, nothing was spoken. The system worked because both understood the code. Entire industries depended on it working. Telegraph offices operated continuously. Messages arrived on written forms, handed across a counter or delivered by messenger. Each message contained a destination, a recipient, and text to be transmitted. The operator read the message, calculated the cost based on word count, and queued it for sending. During busy periods, dozens of messages waited. The operator worked through them in order, converting each into electrical signals and sending them across the wire network. At the receiving office, another operator transcribed the incoming signals back into written text. A messenger then delivered the completed message to the recipient. The process involved no direct conversation between sender and receiver. Information moved as timed electrical pulses, interpreted by trained listening. This system existed because voice could not travel over wire with sufficient clarity or distance. Early attempts at electrical voice transmission failed. The signal degraded over long distances. Static interference made words unintelligible. Human speech proved too complex to transmit reliably through metal conductor wire using available technology. Coded signals solved this problem. A pulse was either present or absent. A trained operator could distinguish between a short pulse and a long pulse even through static or weak signal. The code reduced all language to combinations of two elements. This binary structure made long-distance transmission possible. Telegraph offices were located in railway stations, business districts, and government buildings. The constant sound of incoming signals filled these rooms. Multiple operators worked simultaneously, each monitoring a different line. The sound of one sounder did not interfere with another. Operators learned to isolate the specific rhythm of their assigned circuit. They could identify their line by sound alone, even in a room with 6 or 8 active sounders. Messages arrived at all hours. Night operators handled reduced traffic but remained on duty. Time-sensitive information could not wait for morning. Railway coordination, urgent business correspondence, and emergency notifications required immediate transmission. The network stayed open. Operators worked in shifts. The wire carried only what the code allowed. Complete sentences were compressed. Extra words were removed. Arriving Thursday afternoon train became arrive Thurs aft train. Clients learned to write efficiently. Telegraph companies charged by the word. Brevity reduced cost. Commercial enterprises developed their own abbreviations. Commodity prices, stock transactions, and shipping notices used standardized short forms. Operators transmitted these without needing to understand their full meaning. The code made no distinction between important messages and trivial ones. All information moved at the same speed, limited only by the operator's transmission rate and line availability. A death notice traveled the same way as a lunch invitation. The system treated them identically. The primary instrument was the telegraph key. This was a spring-loaded lever mounted on a wooden or metal base. Pressing the key closed an electrical circuit. Releasing it opened the circuit. The duration of contact determined whether the pulse registered as a dot or a dash. A brief tap produced a dot. Holding the key down longer produced a dash. Spacing between letters and words was created by pausing before the next key press. Operators developed individual rhythm. Experienced telegraphers could identify each other by sending style, the same way handwriting differs between people. The receiving instrument was called a sounder. It consisted of an electromagnet and a metal armature. When current flowed through the wire, the electromagnet pulled the armature down, producing a sharp click. When current stopped, a spring returned the armature to its rest position, producing a softer click. The two clicks together formed the characteristic sound of telegraph reception. A short pulse created two clicks close together. A long pulse created two clicks with more time between them. Operators learned to read by sound rather than by watching the armature move. Visual observation was too slow. Listening allowed faster reception. Skilled operators could copy messages at 25 to 35 words per minute by ear alone. This required complete attention. The operator listened to the sequence of clicks, mentally assembled them into letters, and wrote the letters on paper without breaking rhythm. Any distraction caused errors. If the operator missed a letter, the entire word might become unintelligible. There was no pause button. The sending operator continued at their own pace. If the receiving operator fell behind, they had to request a repeat. This slowed transmission and created frustration on busy lines. Physical endurance mattered. Sending required continuous hand and wrist motion. During periods of heavy traffic, operators sent for hours with minimal rest. Repetitive stress caused pain in the forearm and hand. Some operators developed permanent tremors or joint damage. Receiving required sustained mental focus. The operator could not let attention drift. Even a half-second lapse meant lost characters. Over an 8-hour shift, this level of concentration became exhausting. Operators took short breaks between messages when traffic allowed, but during peak periods, messages queued faster than they could be sent. The wire itself introduced variables. Electrical resistance increased with distance. A strong signal sent from a nearby office arrived as clear, sharp clicks. A weak signal from a distant station produced faint clicks that were harder to distinguish from line noise. Weather affected transmission quality. Lightning storms created static interference. Heavy rain sometimes caused insulation failures. Operators learned to interpret degraded signals, filling in missing characters from context when the line quality was poor. Errors in reception were inevitable. The receiving operator wrote what they heard. If a weak signal made a dash sound like 2 dots, the wrong letter was recorded. If static created a false click, an extra character appeared. Receiving operators developed techniques to catch obvious errors. A word that made no sense was probably transcribed incorrectly. The operator might guess the intended word or mark the message for verification. In critical transmissions, the sending operator was asked to repeat. This doubled transmission time but ensured accuracy. New operators began by learning the code from charts. Each letter of the alphabet corresponded to a specific sequence of dots and dashes. A was dot dash, B was dash dot dot dot, C was dash dot dash dot. Memorization came first. Students practiced writing sequences from dictation until they could produce each letter automatically. Initial training did not involve electrical equipment. Students learned rhythm using sound alone. An instructor tapped out sequences with a pencil or a practice key connected to a sounder with no line. Students wrote down what they heard. Accuracy was measured in percentage of characters correctly copied. Beginners achieved 60 to 70%. This was insufficient for operational work. Training continued until accuracy exceeded 95%. Speed development took months. Early students copied at 5 to 8 words per minute. Professional operators needed to sustain 15 to 20 words per minute for routine work. Express operators on high-traffic lines worked at 30 words per minute or faster. Reaching this speed required daily practice. Students spent hours copying transmitted text, gradually increasing the speed of the practice signal. The transition from reading individual letters to reading whole words marked a critical point in skill development. Beginning operators heard each dot and dash separately, mentally converting the sequence into a letter before writing it. This method was too slow for professional work. Experienced operators recognized entire words as sound patterns. They heard the word "the" as a single rhythm and wrote it without consciously thinking about the 3 individual letters. This shift from letter-by-level reception to word-level reception separated competent operators from beginners. It could not be taught directly. It developed through repetition. Error prevention required multiple techniques. Operators learned to recognize common words by their sound pattern. Unusual or unfamiliar words were copied more carefully, letter by letter. Proper names and technical terms were often spelled out twice for verification. Numbers were particularly vulnerable to error. A single wrong digit in a financial transaction or a train schedule could cause significant problems. Operators developed confirmation protocols. After transmitting a number, the sending operator paused. The receiving operator repeated the number back. Only then did transmission continue. This added time but prevented costly mistakes. Operators also learned to recognize their own limitations. Fatigue reduced accuracy. When an operator noticed increasing errors, they requested relief or slowed their receiving speed. Line supervisors monitored error rates. An operator with consistently high error counts received additional training or was removed from critical circuits. The consequences of mistakes varied. A misspelled word in a personal message caused inconvenience. A wrong number in a commodity price could cost a business thousands of dollars. A mistransmitted train order could cause a collision. Operators worked within a system where errors had weight. Most took the responsibility seriously. Some mistakes were not the operator's fault. Senders sometimes wrote illegible messages. The transmitting operator guessed at unclear letters. If the guess was wrong, the error appeared at the receiving end, but the receiving operator had copied accurately. Blame was difficult to assign. The system included mechanisms for complaint and correction, but tracing an error back to its source often proved impossible. Training programs existed within telegraph companies and as independent schools. Graduates sought positions with railways, news services, or commercial telegraph firms. Hiring depended on demonstrated speed and accuracy. Applicants were tested before employment. A typical test involved copying a 5-minute transmission at standard speed. Results determined placement. High performers received assignments on busy commercial lines. Average performers worked slower circuits. Those who failed to meet minimum standards were not hired. Telegraph lines expanded along railway routes. Railways needed constant communication between stations to coordinate train movements. A single-track line required precise timing to prevent head-on collisions. Dispatchers sent movement orders by telegraph. Station agents acknowledged receipt and confirmed that trains had passed. This information allowed the next section of track to be cleared for use. Without telegraph communication, railways operated at reduced speed with much longer intervals between trains. Adding telegraph capability increased both speed and safety. News organizations built dedicated telegraph networks. Reporters at distant locations sent stories to central editorial offices. Breaking news reached publication faster than postal delivery or messenger transport allowed. Newspapers competed on speed. The first paper to print a major story gained readership. Telegraph transmission provided the necessary advantage. News services employed operators around the clock. Major events generated high message volume. Political developments, military actions, and financial market changes produced hundreds of dispatches per day. Operators at news offices worked in shifts to handle continuous incoming traffic. Government agencies installed telegraph lines for administrative coordination. Military communication particularly relied on coded transmission. Orders could be sent to distant posts within hours instead of days. Diplomatic messages moved between offices faster than any courier could travel. The telegraph became embedded in governmental operations. Commercial telegraph companies offered service to the general public. Western Union and smaller regional firms built networks connecting cities and towns across expanding territories. A business in one city could contact a supplier in another and receive a reply the same day. This changed the pace of commerce. Transactions that once required weeks of mail correspondence could be completed in hours. Message volume grew steadily. In 1860, United States telegraph traffic totaled approximately 5 million messages annually. By 1880, the number exceeded 30 million. By 1900, it surpassed 60 million. Operators were hired in increasing numbers to manage the load. Larger offices employed dozens of operators working simultaneously. Each operator handled a specific route or type of traffic. The division of labor allowed specialization. Some operators worked only financial messages. Others handled railway traffic exclusively. Press operators transmitted nothing but news copy. This specialization increased efficiency. An operator familiar with financial terminology could process stock prices faster than a generalist. A railway operator knew standard train order formats and could send them with minimal delay. Equipment improvements increased capacity without requiring more operators. Duplex systems allowed two messages to travel simultaneously on the same wire, one in each direction. Quadruplex systems enabled 4 simultaneous messages, 2 in each direction. These innovations doubled and then quadrupled the effective capacity of existing wire infrastructure. Installation of additional lines continued where traffic exceeded capacity. Major routes between large cities had multiple parallel wires. Smaller towns might have only a single line. Traffic priority was enforced during congestion. Railway and government messages took precedence over commercial and personal traffic. During emergencies, all non-essential traffic was delayed. Operators worked within a hierarchy of message importance, processing items according to established priority rules. The network expanded internationally. Submarine cables connected continents. A message sent from New York could reach London. Transmission time depended on line availability and distance, but intercontinental communication became possible within the same day. This was unprecedented. Operators at international stations handled messages in multiple languages. Code translation was unnecessary because the signal itself was language neutral, but transcription required literacy in the message language. Multilingual operators were valued for this capability. The growth created employment but also standardized working conditions. Operators worked fixed shifts in supervised offices. The work was sedentary, repetitive, and mentally demanding. Pay varied by skill level and traffic volume. Experienced operators on high-speed lines earned more than beginners on slow rural circuits. Some operators remained in the profession for decades. Others left after a few years due to physical strain or better opportunities elsewhere. Telephone technology developed in parallel with telegraph systems. Early voice transmission was limited to short distances and poor audio quality, but research continued. By 1890, telephone systems operated in major cities, allowing direct spoken conversation over wire. The initial telephone network was separate from the telegraph network, serving different purposes. Telephones enabled real-time conversation. Telegraphs transmitted written messages. For many years, both systems coexisted. Businesses used telegraphs for formal record-keeping and telephones for immediate discussion. The distinction gradually blurred as telephone reliability improved and cost decreased. Long-distance telephone service expanded. By 1910, calls could be placed between cities hundreds of miles apart. Voice quality remained imperfect but understandable. The ability to speak directly, ask questions, and receive immediate answers offered advantages that coded transmission could not match. Telephone conversations conveyed tone, urgency, and nuance. Telegraph messages conveyed only text. For complex negotiations or sensitive discussions, voice communication proved superior. Telegraph traffic began declining in the 1920s. Total message volume dropped year by year. Businesses shifted routine correspondence to telephone calls. Personal messages moved to telephones as residential service became common. The telegraph remained useful for specific applications where written confirmation was required, but general-purpose communication migrated away from coded transmission. Operators noticed the change in daily workload. Offices that once handled continuous traffic experienced long, quiet periods. Messages that arrived were often formal notifications, legal documents, or international communications where telephone service was unavailable or prohibitively expensive. The work became less urgent. Fewer operators were needed. Telegraph companies reduced staffing. Experienced operators were reassigned to telephone operations or retired. Junior operators were not replaced when they left. Some offices consolidated, combining routes that once required separate operators. A single operator might monitor 3 or 4 lines, handling occasional traffic on each. The pace slowed. Railway telegraph use declined as radio communication improved. Train dispatchers adopted radio systems that allowed direct voice contact with locomotive crews. This eliminated the need for station agents to relay messages. Telegraph offices in railway stations closed or were repurposed. The equipment was removed or left in place, unused. Newspaper reliance on telegraph transmission decreased as teletype machines and later wire photo systems were introduced. These technologies still used coded transmission, but the coding was automated. Operators no longer listened to sounders and transcribed manually. The machines printed text directly. Human intervention was reduced to monitoring equipment and handling paper. Press operators who had worked sounders for years found their skills obsolete. Some adapted to the new equipment. Others left the industry. Commercial telegraph service persisted longer in rural areas where telephone infrastructure lagged behind urban development. Small towns without reliable telephone service continued using telegraph for external communication. These offices operated with reduced hours and minimal staff. As telephone lines reached more remote locations, even this residual traffic disappeared. The decline was gradual, not sudden. No single event ended telegraph operation. It faded across decades as alternative systems became more practical and affordable. Message counts dropped, revenue fell, companies closed unprofitable offices, networks shrank. Operators who had spent careers listening to coded signals found that their expertise was no longer needed. Some transitioned to other communication work. Many simply retired. The knowledge of high-speed code reception, built over years of practice, had no application outside telegraph operation. It could not be transferred to other employment. When the last operators stopped working, the skill disappeared with them. Telegraph offices closed quietly. Equipment was disconnected and removed. Sounders, keys, and wire were sold as surplus or discarded. Office space was converted to other uses. In railway stations, former telegraph rooms became storage areas or waiting rooms. In commercial buildings, the space was leased to new tenants. No ceremony marked these closures. The work simply stopped. In some locations, equipment remained in place long after operation ceased. Sounders sat on desks, keys rested on tables, wire ran along walls and ceilings. The physical infrastructure outlasted its function. Visitors to old railway stations occasionally found dusty telegraph instruments in back rooms, disconnected and silent. These remnants had no practical value. They were ignored or eventually removed during renovation. Operators left the network without fanfare. Those who retired received standard pensions if their employers offered them. Those who moved to other work carried skills that had limited transferability. The ability to send and receive coded messages at high speed had no civilian application once the telegraph network closed. A few operators preserved their knowledge as a personal skill, practicing code reception as a hobby. Most did not. The work had been employment, not recreation. When it ended, they moved on. Some telegraph companies continued operating into the late 20th century, handling specialized traffic. Mailgrams and similar services used automated telegraph systems for message delivery, but these did not require human operators listening to sounders. The messages were typed into machines that converted text to signal automatically. Reception was also automated. The machines printed incoming messages without human interpretation. This was telegraph transmission, but it was not the work that earlier operators had performed. The last manually operated commercial telegraph circuits in the United States closed in the early 1970s. A few hobbyist networks and historical demonstrations continued using traditional equipment, but these were not operational communication systems. They were preservations of technique, maintained by individuals interested in historical technology. Functional communication had moved entirely to voice, automated text, and eventually digital systems. The skills operators developed became historical knowledge. Training manuals, code charts, and old equipment were kept in archives and museums. Researchers studying communication history examined these materials, but the practical ability to send and receive messages by manually keyed code largely vanished. The operators who possessed that ability aged and died. Younger generations learned about telegraph operation from books and recordings, not from direct practice. The infrastructure was repurposed or abandoned. Telegraph poles and wire that once carried thousands of messages per day were taken down or left to decay. Some wire was reused for early telephone lines. Much of it was simply removed. The poles rotted or were cut down. In remote areas, remnants of old telegraph lines remained visible for decades, rusted wire sagging between weathered poles carrying nothing. Messages continued moving. Information still traveled long distances nearly instantaneously. The method changed. Voice replaced code. Later, digital data replaced both. The fundamental function persisted, independent of the technology used. What people wanted to communicate and the need to communicate it quickly did not disappear. Only the mechanism of transmission changed. The work of converting language into electrical signals and back into language no longer required human rhythm and trained listening. It happened inside machines, invisibly and automatically. Operators were not needed. Information moved without them and continued moving long after the sounders fell silent.